Well, I imagine that on this November 2nd, some of us, at least, are still living just a bit of Halloween. Perhaps like me, you've had Snickers and Tootsie Rolls for 3 of the last 4 meals that you've eaten. And maybe, like me, you have raided that bucket of candy because how could they possibly eat all of this candy, really? Every year, while I love the change of the season and I love that stroke of midnight that takes everything from Halloween to Christmas, as we've joked about before, I like to hold on to Halloween for just a few more days. This time of year that we lean into make-believe, we lean into fun. We celebrate and we accept each other even as we're dressed in wild, silly, ridiculous costumes, maybe. It always feels like just what we need, love and acceptance, and not questioning how someone looks, just accepting that they are who they say they are. It is a really beautiful thing. Well, this year, while we were exploring our beloved Halloween in College Hill, we noticed one of our favorite houses had a Stranger Things theme. Now, if you don't know about Stranger Things, it's a TV series, and the premise is a gateway to another dimension has been discovered. That dimension, known as the Upside Down, is a really dark place full of monsters and all the scary things that you find in the horror genre. The Upside Down is obviously a place to avoid. It's one that doesn't make any sense. Now, this story is about a community of kids and a couple of parents who battle against those monsters, all of the unknowns, all of the fear that makes the monsters and the unknowns even more real. And while the writers may not have focused on this angle, as the characters work together, their bonds strengthen and they begin to understand each other in ways that wouldn't have been possible. Now, this particular house that had the incredible display of all of the scenes in this show was amazing and scary and really did look like the movie. And one day when I was walking past their house, I saw one of the owners scooping up some leaves, and I said, it's really strange that you're in the Upside Down brushing up leaves. She laughed and said, yeah, you got to keep it clean even though you're dealing with all of these scary monsters and things. Well, everyone in the neighborhood of course, enjoyed seeing the creations, not just of that house, but of others. That Upside Down that I talked about is such an interesting concept, something that is totally opposite. And as I read this week, studying for the sermon, I noticed that the term Topsy-Turvy, or as we say sometimes upside down, is a favorite among writers explaining this passage. Topsy-turvy blessing is what Union New Testament professor John Carroll calls this passage. Jesus is offering a word of blessing and turning things upside down. He does it in ways that are really good news for those who are desperate, for those who don't see a way out of their circumstances. Today we heard Luke's version, and there are some interesting differences between this and Matthew's version that we usually hear. Maybe we prefer Matthew's version anyway because it takes place on a mount, and that's why that's called the Sermon on the Mount. Luke's setting is a plain, and that's why we call it the Sermon on the Plain. And it actually does matter, that subtle difference that I'll talk about here in a moment. One of the reasons maybe that we like the other version better is because Matthew doesn't include the woe stuff. Blessed has become a pretty churchy word. Have you noticed? And this is something we've talked about before. Happy is another common translation of that Greek word. But it's a word that is too small in our understanding in our world today. Really, this word means unburdened or satisfied. Jesus addresses the people who are the opposite of the first groups, the wealthy, the satiated, the laughing, and to those he cries out, woe. In this context, woe is a sharp contrast to that blessed, that satisfied. And yet, again, looking at the Greek word, it doesn't really mean cursed or unhappy. It, like the English word yike, an attention getter, a word that sets an emotion for us, that offers this clear understanding of the pronouncement that one is making. Jesus promises relief then to those groups, to those people who struggle in life. And to others whose life is easy, he said, look out, wake up, pay attention, notice. Louisville Seminary professor, the Reverend Dr. Deborah Mumford, points out something interesting about those who are listening to this sermon. She said there were actually three groups of people gathered around Jesus at this moment: a crowd, disciples, and apostles. So when Jesus looked out of all the people he saw, men and women, boys and girls, young and old, Jew and Gentile, he saw their needs. Each of these groups of people needed very different things from Jesus, she says. The first group was the crowd. We read that the crowd was made up of people from everywhere, and while they wanted to hear what Jesus had to say, the purpose of their presence was very pragmatic. They first and foremost needed Jesus to heal them. Some had various illnesses and diseases, and others had unclean or evil spirits from which they wanted relief. We don't really know exactly how many people were in the crowd, but we know that Jesus healed all of them, met their physical needs, which likely healed them emotionally, while also restoring them to fullness of life in their communities. Again, something we have talked about many times, that when you had some sort of reason to be in the outskirts of society, you couldn't get back for any reason. And so Jesus healing that brought a full wholeness to those who received that healing. The second group was the disciples, those who followed Jesus and who only wanted to hear what Jesus had to say, not only wanted to hear what Jesus had to say, but also wanted and needed to learn from him. With their learnings, they would also be able to shape and change their thinking and living to connect with the will of God that Jesus had communicated to them. And the third, she says, was composed of the newly appointed apostles. And while the apostles were also disciples, not all disciples were apostles. Those were people hand-selected by Jesus to be to teach, even after he wasn't here anymore, to continue to do the work that he began during this ministry. As Jesus shared these words then, each group really had a different purpose, a different reason for being there, different ears to hear. And in fact, and because of that, they had different levels of engagement in these words. The crowd that was listening just for what they needed to get from Jesus in order to be healed were there for a particular purpose. The disciples were listening much closer. They were listening for understanding so that they could take these teachings, apply them to their own lives. The apostles were likely not only listening even closer than the disciples, they were also watching Jesus' actions intently because they were expected to do what he did in the world. You know, it occurs to me that this is true in every group, and I believe it's worth asking ourselves who we are in our communities. How are we engaged in the life of the communities that we are a part of? And how are we engaged in other lives as well? Do we engage in the life of this church because we need healing, maybe? Do we come because we feel called to aid in that healing? Maybe that, too. Do we believe that gathering as the community, that listening to the Word of God, that can actually transform us? And are we willing to actually live as truly transformed people? Certainly there are many reasons that bring us to worship, many reasons that bring us into the community, into this congregation. But Jesus urges hearers to think about their lives as Jesus is offering this new way. His woe statements are really revealing, aren't they? That things we assume that are advantages really are just illusions. What if money and food and comfort, self-won security, respectability, and the like are things that would hurt us? Not just in some far-off afterlife, but right here, right now. Matt Skinner, a professor, asked the question, what a tragedy it would be what a tragedy it would be to mistake benefits from God. And that takes me to the part that we overlook. Where we are, the location of this message. Matthew's takes place on a mountain, and that's, again, why we call it the Sermon on the Mount. But Luke, this takes place on a plain. And it's interesting to imagine what this looks like. Jesus is meeting the people where they are. If we want to get close to Jesus, if we want to truly understand what he has called us to do, then we will meet people where they are as well, with others, and really try to imagine what life is like for those who are different, whose experience is different than ours. Perhaps it even requires turning things upside down a bit, looking at the stranger things that we are that others experience, that are a part of our siblings, our sisters, our brothers' experiences, and not of ours. It means leaning into the battles that others face and creating space where others don't have to battle as much. Friends, it means little things like groceries, which actually aren't little things. But it also means bigger things like working for change in our society. It means noticing when others are struggling and meeting their needs. That's where Jesus calls us, meeting us on level ground, meeting us where we are, and inviting us into relationship and into sharing that with the world. Friends, that is our good news, and it's our good news for today, and my friends, it's our good news for every day. May it be so.